Hammurabi and his code. Let's start way back, almost 4,000 years ago, with King Hammurabi of Babylon. He ruled around 1754 BCE, and his name is forever linked to something that changed history, the Code of Hammurabi. Now here's why it mattered so much. Before this, laws were mostly unwritten. Justice often depended on a ruler's mood or raw power. Hammurabi turned that on its head. He had 282 laws carved into stone pillars, placed in public so everyone could literally see the law. Imagine that. Your rights and punishments weren't secret. They were out in the open for all citizens, rich or poor. His code covered almost every part of life: property disputes, trade, family issues, even wages. It was harsh, an eye for an eye justice. But for the first time, people saw a king submit himself to a written system. That was revolutionary. The impact: immediate order in Babylon, stronger trust in Hammurabi's rule, and long-term influence on nearly every legal system that followed, from Roman law to modern civil codes. In short, Hammurabi took justice from being arbitrary to being structured, and that idea outlived him by millennia. Solon and his reforms. Let's move to Athens, around 594 BCE, when the city was on the edge of collapse. Most farmers were drowning in debt, nobles owned nearly everything, and thousands of poor Athenians were being sold into slavery just because they couldn't pay what they owed. That's when the Athenians turned to Solon. Solon wasn't a tyrant. He was chosen because both rich and poor trusted his wisdom. And he made one of the boldest moves of the ancient world. He completely abolished debt slavery. Overnight, men who had been chained for debts were free, and families broken apart were restored. That alone was groundbreaking. But he didn't stop there. He reorganized Athenian society into 4 classes based on wealth instead of noble birth. That meant even if you weren't an aristocrat, you could now hold office or have a political voice, depending on your class. For the first time, power wasn't locked to bloodlines. It was open to ability and contribution. The outcome? The rich stayed rich, but the poor finally had dignity and legal protection. Solon didn't create democracy yet, but he planted the seed. His reforms curbed aristocratic dominance and opened the door for later leaders to build participatory government. Without him, Athens might never have given the world the idea of democracy. Ashoka the Great and his edicts. Now imagine an emperor who ruled over most of India, one of the largest empires of the ancient world. That was Ashoka the Great, around 250 BCE. Early in his reign, he was ruthless, and the turning point came after the bloody Kalinga War, where more than 100,000 people died. Witnessing that carnage shattered him. Instead of doubling down on violence, Ashoka did something unheard of. He embraced Buddhism and rewrote how an empire should be ruled. All across India, he had his laws carved into stone pillars and rock faces, the famous edicts of Ashoka. But these laws weren't about crushing enemies. They promoted non-violence, compassion for all living beings, and religious tolerance. He ordered welfare programs, planted trees along roads, built wells and rest houses, and even created veterinary clinics. Ashoka was essentially saying, a king's duty is not conquest, but care. In a world where rulers showed strength through bloodshed, this was revolutionary. The impact: his empire became a model of ethical governance. Buddhism spread across Asia because of his support, and his edicts remain some of the earliest legal texts promoting compassion and coexistence. Ashoka proved power could be used not just to dominate, but to heal, and that insight still echoes today. Justinian I and the Corpus Juris Civilis. Jump ahead to Constantinople, capital of the Byzantine Empire, in the 500 CE. Emperor Justinian I wanted to restore Rome's greatness, and he realized there was chaos at the heart of society, the law itself. Centuries of Roman rules had piled up, contradictory, outdated, and confusing. No one really knew what the law was. So Justinian launched one of history's most ambitious legal projects. He gathered top jurists, led by Tribonian, and ordered them to collect, review, and rewrite everything into a clear, unified system. The result was the Corpus Juris Civilis, or body of civil law. It had 4 parts: the Code, a collection of laws; the Digest, legal opinions; the Institutes, a textbook for students; and the Novels, new laws issued under Justinian. Why was this so revolutionary? For the first time, an empire had a single, coherent legal backbone. It standardized justice, made law accessible, and curbed corruption by stripping away contradictions. For Byzantium, it created order, but its real power came later. The Justinian Code became the foundation of civil law in most of Europe, inspiring everything from the Napoleonic Code to modern constitutions. In short, Justinian didn't just rule an empire. He gave the Western world a legal language still echoing 1,500 years later. King John and the Magna Carta. Let's head to England in 1215. King John was on the throne, and he wasn't exactly beloved. Heavy taxes, failed wars in France, and his habit of exploiting royal power had pushed his barons to the breaking point. The country was on the verge of rebellion. So in June of that year, John was cornered at Runnymede and forced to seal a document that would change the world, the Magna Carta, or Great Charter. For the first time, a king put his name to an agreement saying his power had limits. He couldn't just raise taxes without consent. He couldn't jail people without cause, and even he had to follow the law. Now, at the time, John had no intention of keeping his promises. He appealed to the Pope, tore up the deal, and plunged England into civil war. But the charter survived. It was reissued by later monarchs, studied by lawyers for centuries, and eventually became a cornerstone of constitutional government. Why does it matter today? Because Magna Carta planted the seed that no ruler is above the law. That idea traveled through the English Bill of Rights, to the American Constitution, and into the global concept of human rights. What began as a peace deal between an unpopular king and angry nobles became the foundation of modern liberty. Louis IX and legal reform. Picture France in the 1200s, when justice often meant superstition. If you were accused of a crime, you might be thrown into a river. If you floated, you were guilty. That was the logic of the trial by ordeal. Sounds absurd today, but it was common practice. Enter King Louis IX, also known later as Saint Louis. Ruling from 1226 to 1270, he believed kingship meant duty before God, and part of that duty was fair justice. He revolutionized French law by banning ordeals and replacing them with reasoned, consistent legal processes. He expanded royal courts, where trained judges decided cases instead of leaving verdicts up to luck or divine signs. Louis went further. He created a centralized system of appeals, making the crown the highest authority in justice. That weakened the old feudal lord's control and ensured ordinary people could appeal directly to the king's court. For the first time, justice started to look less like chaos and more like a structured legal system. The long-term impact was huge. Louis's reforms helped set France on the path toward a national legal identity, influenced European legal thought, and marked a turning point from medieval superstition toward rule of law. In short, Louis IX dragged justice out of the river and put it inside the courtroom, and the ripple effects are still felt today. Peter the Great and the Table of Ranks. Let's jump to Russia in the late 1600s, a huge empire still rooted in medieval traditions while Europe was modernizing fast. Then comes Peter the Great, a larger-than-life Tsar who believed Russia had to change, or be left behind. Peter traveled across Europe incognito, studying shipyards, armies, and governments. What he saw convinced him that Russia needed to transform from top to bottom. His most famous reform was the Table of Ranks, introduced in 1722. Instead of high office being reserved for old noble families, Peter created a 14-level system where anyone, noble or commoner, could rise through military or civil service. Loyalty, skill, and years of service mattered more than just bloodline. But that was only part of his westernization push. He modernized the army with European tactics, built a navy from scratch, introduced new schools for science and engineering, even forced boyars to shave their beards to look more modern. He capped it off by founding a brand new capital, St. Petersburg, built as a window to the West. The result? Russia emerged as a European great power, its society tied closer to state service than feudal privilege. The Table of Ranks lasted until the 20th century, shaping Russian bureaucracy for 200 years. In short, Peter didn't just reform Russia, he dragged it into the modern age, leaving fingerprints on both its strengths and its struggles. Frederick the Great and Enlightened Reform. Now let's move to 18th century Prussia, a state known for its iron discipline and military machine. At first glance, you'd expect its ruler, Frederick the Great, to be just another warrior king. And yes, he was a brilliant general, but he was also one of Europe's great enlightened monarchs, and his laws proved it. Frederick believed rulers should be the first servant of the state, so he applied reason to governance. He introduced religious tolerance, declaring that in his words, all religions must be tolerated, for every man must get to heaven in his own way. In a Europe still racked by sectarian divides, that was radical. Even more groundbreaking, he abolished judicial torture in most cases, declaring it both cruel and useless. In courts, evidence and procedure began to matter more than fear or confessions forced under pain. For hard-edged Prussia, that was a major shift toward rational justice. Of course, he kept the country militarized, but his reforms gave Prussia a reputation not only for soldiers but also for enlightened governance. The long-term impact. These ideas seeped across Europe, influencing later legal codes, and showed that even a militaristic state could embrace Enlightenment values. Frederick proved that true power wasn't just in armies, but in reshaping laws through reason. and that balance made him one of the most influential monarchs of his century. Maria Theresa and compulsory education. In the 1700s, Austria was a sprawling empire of many peoples, languages, and traditions. Holding it together wasn't easy, but Maria Theresa, the only female ruler of the Habsburg dynasty, found a powerful tool: education. In 1774, she issued the General School Ordinance, making basic education compulsory for all children between ages 6 and 12. This was groundbreaking. Most rulers saw schools as optional, but she turned them into a legal duty. Thousands of new village schools were built, funded by the state, and teachers were trained to provide a standard curriculum: reading, writing, arithmetic, and moral instruction. Why was this so revolutionary? Because it wasn't just about literacy. Education made citizens more productive, unified the empire's diverse populations, and strengthened loyalty to the crown. For peasants, it meant opportunities that their families had never had before. The impact lasted long beyond Maria Theresa. Austria became one of the first major states with a public education system, inspiring reforms across Europe. This moment marked the shift from schooling as a privilege for elites to a right and responsibility for everyone. In short, Maria Theresa transformed classrooms into a tool of nation-building, proving that laws about children's futures could shape the destiny of an entire empire. Joseph II and radical reform. After Maria Theresa came her son, Joseph II, ruling Austria in the late 1700s. If his mother reshaped education, Joseph tried to reshape society itself. He was one of Europe's boldest enlightened despots, determined to drag his empire into a new age of reason. In 1781, he issued the Edict of Tolerance, granting Protestants, Orthodox Christians, and Jews the right to practice openly, build schools, and enter professions, huge steps in an age when religious minorities were often shut out. The very next year, he struck at the backbone of feudalism. He abolished serfdom. Peasants could now marry without permission, work for wages, and move freely across the empire, transforming millions of lives almost overnight. These reforms were radical, but they weren't popular with everyone. Nobles hated losing control of their serfs, and even ordinary villagers sometimes struggled with sudden freedom in a rigid economy. Still, Joseph believed, as he said, that everything for the people, nothing by the people was the essence of rule. The legacy: many of his reforms were rolled back after his death, yet the ideals stayed alive. Religious tolerance and the end of serfdom set Austria on a long path toward modernization. Joseph II proved that one monarch, even against resistance, could legislate compassion, equality, and freedom into law, ideas centuries ahead of their time. Napoleon and the Napoleonic Code. When people think of Napoleon Bonaparte, they picture battlefields and empire. But his most lasting conquest wasn't won with cannons. It was written on paper. In 1804, he introduced the Napoleonic Code, one of the most influential legal frameworks in history. At the time, French law was a mess. Local customs, feudal codes, and old royal edicts overlapped, creating confusion and inequality. Napoleon ordered a single, simple, nationwide code that everyone, from Paris nobles to southern farmers, would follow. The code covered civil rights, property ownership, contracts, marriage, and inheritance. It swept away noble privileges, insisted all men were equal before the law, and made property rights sacred. It was clear, written in plain language, and meant to be understood by anyone, not just lawyers. Its impact went way beyond France. As Napoleon's armies spread, so did his laws, across Europe, into Latin America, and even influencing legal systems in Asia and Africa. Today, more than 70 countries trace parts of their civil law back to it, from Italy and Spain to Japan. In the end, Napoleon's empire collapsed, but his legal empire never did. The Napoleonic Code outlived him by centuries, and still shapes how the modern world defines rights, contracts, and equality before the law. Alexander II and the emancipation of the serfs. By the mid-1800s, Russia looked powerful on the map, but inside it was stuck in the past. About one-third of the entire population, 23 million people, were serfs, legally bound to the land and their landlords, living in conditions not far from slavery. After Russia's defeat in the Crimean War, it was obvious the empire couldn't modernize while half its people were chained to feudalism. In 1861, Tsar Alexander II issued the Emancipation Manifesto, freeing the serfs. Overnight, millions gained the legal right to marry without permission, own property, and move where they wished. Landowners were forced to give up land to peasants, though the peasants had to pay long redemption payments to the state. The reform was imperfect. Many peasants remained in poverty, tied to small plots and heavy debts, but socially it was revolutionary. It broke a system that had defined Russia for centuries, weakened the nobility's grip, and created the free rural population that would later fuel industry and, eventually, revolution. Alexander II became known as the Tsar Liberator, though the nobility never forgave him. Ironically, his bold reforms made both elites and radicals angry, and he was assassinated by revolutionaries in 1881. Still, his emancipation set Russia on the path away from medieval bondage, making it one of the most significant acts of social reform in 19th century Europe. Emperor Meiji and the transformation of Japan. In 1868, Japan was still a feudal society, samurai ruling domains, peasants tied to the land, while Western powers loomed with modern industries and armies. Then came the Meiji Restoration, with a young Emperor Meiji at its center. He and his reformers made a daring decision: dismantle centuries of tradition to save Japan's independence. The first step was ending the old feudal domains and absorbing them into a centralized state. The samurai class lost exclusive privileges, and a modern conscript army replaced them. Then came sweeping modernization laws, new schools to educate every child, railways and factories to industrialize the economy, and Western science and technology imported at lightning speed. The capstone was the Meiji Constitution of 1889, which created an elected legislature and legally defined rights and duties of citizens, while keeping the emperor as a unifying symbol. For the first time, Japan had a modern legal and political framework that could rival Europe's. The result? In just a few decades, Japan went from near-medieval isolation to a global industrial power. By 1905, it had defeated Russia in war, the first time an Asian nation beat a European empire in modern combat. The Meiji era proved how law and reform could compress centuries of change into one generation, and it marked Japan's leap onto the world stage as a modern state. Rama V and the peaceful end of slavery. In the late 1800s, while much of Asia was being carved up by colonial powers, Siam, modern Thailand, kept its independence. A big reason was King Chulalongkorn, Rama V, a reformer who understood that survival meant modernization. One of his boldest acts was abolishing slavery, at a time when nearly one-third of Siam's population lived as slaves. Instead of sudden bans that risked revolt, Rama V took a gradual, humane approach. He began by freeing children born after certain dates and limiting how much debt slavery could bind someone. Over the years, step by step, these reforms chipped away at the system until slavery disappeared entirely by the early 20th century. What made his emancipation unique is how peaceful it was. In the United States and Russia, slavery and serfdom had ended in bloodshed or unrest. In Siam, emancipation happened without civil war, because Rama V paired reform with stability, educating freed citizens, modernizing government, and building infrastructure to absorb social change. The impact was enormous. Millions gained freedom. Siam moved closer to a modern nation-state, and crucially, these reforms strengthened the monarchy's image as a protector of the people. It also helped Siam resist colonization by showing Europe it was a civilized and progressive power. Rama V's path proved that even one of history's most oppressive systems could end not by violence, but by careful law and steady leadership. Atatürk and the transformation of Turkey. In 1923, the Ottoman Empire was gone, and from its ashes rose modern Turkey, led by Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. Though a president, he ruled with the force of a reforming monarch, determined to drag Turkey into the modern world. His weapon wasn't conquest, it was law. Atatürk's most radical step was replacing centuries of Islamic Sharia with a new civil code, modeled on Switzerland's. Marriage, inheritance, and contracts were now handled under secular law, not religion, a seismic shift in a country where mosque and state had been one. But he didn't stop there. He granted women the right to vote and hold office by the 1930s, decades ahead of many European nations. He banned polygamy, reformed education into a national secular system, and even changed daily life, switching from the Arabic script to the modern Turkish alphabet and banning the fez to symbolize a break with the Ottoman past. The outcome? Within just 15 years, Turkey transformed from a fallen empire into a modern republic, legally secular, nationally unified, and legally equal for men and women. These reforms faced resistance, but they cemented Atatürk as the father of modern Turkey. His laws proved how one leader, armed with legal reform instead of armies, could reinvent a nation's identity almost overnight, and his legacy still defines Turkey today.